So I pulled a Google trend search for the term Airbnb for the United States for the past 12 months. I also added search terms for VRBO and Furnished Finder. Airbnb is the blue line, VRBO is the red line, and Furnished Finder is the yellow line. And Airbnb, while declining because of seasonality, clearly has quite a bit more search volume than VRBO or Furnished Finder. And the reason I did this is to show you how many more of your future tenants know about Airbnb than they do the other platforms. Therefore, name recognition and search volume is the #1 reason to use Airbnb for long-term furnished rentals, aka midterm rentals in 2025. If you are new to this channel, welcome. My name is Erin Spradlin. I help new landlord hosts find tenants for their 30+ day furnished rentals. I have written 3 books on this topic. I have had my own furnished 30+ day rentals since 2017, and the focus of this channel is to help landlord hosts with 5 or fewer properties find tenants for their 30+ day furnished rentals. Also good for you to know, I am not an insurance broker, I am not a lawyer, I am not an accountant, and any information I give you should be backed up with a professional in one of those areas. This video is going to cover whether or not it makes sense to use Airbnb in 2025, because while Airbnb has some major advantages, it also has some not insignificant disadvantages, and we'll talk about both in this video. Let's take a minute to discuss definitions and also what limitations you may have using Airbnb with your city or HOA. For those of you that are new here, I call long-term Airbnb rentals midterm rentals. Midterm rentals are rentals that are furnished, the tenants stay for 30 days or longer, and there's only one lease on the property. This model is also called long-term furnished rentals, medium-term rentals, the traveling nurse strategy, the corporate rental strategy, and it has also been associated with other platforms like Furnished Finder and corporate housing by owner. Now, for those of you that have city or HOA concerns, you might be thinking my city or my HOA has outlawed Airbnb. Your city or HOA has probably not outlawed Airbnb, but they probably have outlawed renting for fewer than 30 days. Or if they have a limitation, that's what the limitation is. So if a city has written something into their code, it's usually for 30 days or fewer. Same thing with an HOA. Although with HOAs and I guess with cities, you want to make sure that the word Airbnb is not associated with the code at all, and that the limitation is on the number of days and not the platform. And related to that, the sooner you can stop thinking about Airbnb as a short-term vacation rental platform and start thinking about it as a rental platform for furnished rentals, the better. Let's start with an example. It will do 2 things: provide some context for the money people are making on their properties in this midterm space, and second, it will tie into the second reason why Airbnb is useful in the furnished rental space. So I have been working with a couple that we'll call S&J. S&J own a property outside of DC, and they got it rented 7 days after it went live on Airbnb. The rental was for 3 months. It was for 4 people and 2 dogs, and S&J are getting paid $161 per night. If we extrapolate this to an annual rate, it is 161 times 365, which equals 58,765, so almost 60K. I tell my clients to assume a 20% vacancy rate, so an 80% occupancy rate, and that's because it's always good to be conservative with your rentals. Better to be pleasantly surprised than financially devastated. So if we assume an 80% occupancy rate, they will get paid $47,000 in rents this year for that property at this rate. By the way, if you are interested in getting the help that S&J did, I have linked my consulting options in the description of this video. They booked the hand-holding package, as in I'll hold your hand through the first rental with your first tenant and also set your property up so that all the back-end settings, etc. are right. Back to S&J. Well, it's great that they got this rental. They secured the rental during Q4, so October, November, December. They secured the rental in December, although it's not starting until January. And this is the absolute worst time to get a rental. And the reason for that is because people are both distracted with the holidays and they also don't want to deal with the weather. This brings us to another advantage of Airbnb. So the second benefit of being on Airbnb, which is pricing on the monthly level. On most platforms, you don't necessarily want to take a listing in mid-December because that rate will be lower than for the rest of the year. Airbnb is different though. You don't need to worry about this because you can price each month differently. Therefore, you can give deep discounts in November and December, which results in you making some money versus no money, because making some money versus no money is always better. And you can comfortably accept a tenant that comes in for 6 months or 4 months, because this does happen in the midterm rental space and it does happen on Airbnb sometimes that someone wants a longer rental. And you can do this because you know your pricing is set for the rest of the year and you'll recoup those costs as you move out of slow season. This is not a functionality you see in the other platforms. In other platforms, there's the possibility of having a major issue, or at the very least, an uncomfortable conversation, because you have to explain that the price they saw is just the November, December price, but that it's actually going to cost more for later months. Midterm tenants tend to mirror the behavior patterns of the other tenants on the platform. So with Airbnb, the tenants know that some days, some months, some holidays are worth more, and they accept that they may have to pay more. On other platforms, the tenants act like long-term tenants, which assumes every month is the same when they are not. So this puts the host/landlord, aka you, in an awkward position if a tenant comes in and they want to rent for 4 months, 6 months, etc., because you either have to tell them the price you see isn't actually the price, or you, the host, is going to have to lose money on that discounted rate. You might be saying, well, I'll just set my price and wait. That's fine, but then you have vacancy and that also can become an issue. Before we get into the third pro of Airbnb, if you have learned something in this video so far, please like it. If you are looking for more content about the different platforms, how to secure your first tenant, best practices around midterm rentals, subscribe, because that is what this channel is about. Okay, so let's get into the third pro of Airbnb, which is AirCover. This could easily be a pro or a con. We'll move it into the gray area. So let's talk about why it's good. So hosts are covered up to $3 million for property damage, $1 million for personal liability. AirCover will also cover you for lost income. So if someone burns down the kitchen and the rental is down for a while, the host can recoup lost income with AirCover. And with this, you may not need landlord insurance if you only rent on Airbnb. Caveat, again, I am not an insurance broker, and you should check with your insurance broker, but you should also compare what AirCover will protect you with and what landlord insurance will cover you with, because they're very similar. Back to AirCover. So why did we move it in the gray? Well, it's always awkward when I talk about Airbnb now because I've talked about it differently in my books. In American Nomads, I was pretty hard on Airbnb, which I'll get to in a minute. And in Guide to Midterm Rentals, I was more measured. But I think some of that has to do with how easy it was to get renters in 2017 versus how much more challenging it is to get midterm renters in 2025. And really, my shift toward Airbnb in the last few years comes from my consulting clients having success on Airbnb and my own success on Airbnb. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because in American Nomads, I'm talking about how much I dislike Airbnb because they become a third-party arbiter that dictates if you get paid if there's a problem. So other platforms allow you to hold the deposit, and if you have the deposit, as in you hold the deposit, you decide if and when you get paid if there's damage from a renter. If you are on Airbnb, you have to file a claim, much like an insurance company, and then Airbnb decides if you get paid out. As much as I don't love this, it's worth pointing out two things. One, if you take a deposit on a tenant on a different platform and they trash your place, you only have the amount of the deposit to make you whole. So yes, you could take them to court, but 99% of the time, it's not gonna be worth your time or your money. And on Airbnb, you are covered up to that $3 million threshold. So even though it might require jumping through some hoops, that $3 million does exist as coverage to you. Second, we're seeing other platforms adopt this. Because I think hosts get hassled a lot about deposits on Furnished Finder, Furnished Finder has rolled out an insurance product to offset a deposit. I understand why they did this, but it puts you in the same situation as you would be with Airbnb, meaning that there's a third-party arbiter deciding if you get paid out or not. So the first con to Airbnb is that you don't control the deposit. The second con with Airbnb, and one that concerns me more, is their limited background check. So I think this is a legitimate issue when you bump into the 30-day space with tenants. So Airbnb only vets the guests to the extent that Airbnb verifies that the guests' government issued documents, so their license or their passport, is legit. But in general, vetting on Airbnb is really limited to what other hosts have said about the tenants, and then also how you feel about the way the tenant is communicating with you. For a short-term rental, maybe this is fine, because if you have a problem with a tenant, they're only a problem for like 4 days or so. But if it's a problem for a 30+ day tenant, that's a bigger issue. And I think that's a reasonable argument for why more vetting should be added to the platform, but it doesn't exist yet. Okay, so the third issue with Airbnb is the lease. For this one, I think it's more of an issue in the host mind than it is an actual problem. And you might be thinking, that's ridiculous, Erin. If someone comes in for 30+ days, I need a lease. Well, the reason why I don't think it's that big of a deal is because a lease is a contract that has a begin date, an end date, an address, and an agreement to pay a certain amount for that period of time. And an Airbnb rental agreement has all of those elements as well. So if you had an eviction issue, you would print off the booking details and begin the eviction process with that, just as you would with a lease. Okay, and then the fourth and final con with Airbnb is the price. They charge more than the other platforms, and this is to pay for AirCover. So Airbnb will take 3% from the hosts and 15% from the guests. They also charge for taxes, so all of that has to be factored in. Unequivocally, Airbnb is more expensive than other platforms. And what you have to ask yourself is, will I lose more money with vacancy, or will I lose more money with Airbnb's fees? Personally, I am more worried about losing money on vacancy. Let's end with a quote from Mark Zuckerberg. "The biggest risk is not taking any risk. In a world that is changing really quickly, the only strategy that is guaranteed to fail is not taking any risks." Not only do I think being on Airbnb is a risk worth taking, but I do think it's critical to getting renters for your furnished 30+ day rental in 2025.